acoustic treatment for speech. Let's look at the case study of a speech auditorium. The aim of acoustic treatment for speech. Let's look at the case study of a speech auditorium. In a speech auditorium, we want to provide clear, intelligible speech to the occupants so they can clearly understand what is being said. In order to do this, it is necessary to control the reverberance in the space, but also control discrete, late reflections that might impair speech intelligibility. To facilitate this, the ceiling should be reflective, above and in front of the speaker's head, and positioned at a low height. By doing this, we're able to provide useful early reflections of sound towards the audience. These early reflections of sound augment the direct sound coming out of the speaker's mouth, and it makes the speech more intelligible. The rear wall of a speech auditorium should be sound absorptive to prevent reflections back to the speaker. Ceiling areas away from the speaker, more distant from the speaker, behind the speaker's head, should be absorptive to prevent late reflections of sound coming back towards the audience that might impair intelligibility. Sidewalls near the speaker should be reflective to provide those useful early reflections of sound, and can be movable to create a smaller enclosure around the speaker to be more intimate. The example on the top right-hand side there is that of a courtroom, and in this situation it is critical that there is clear and intelligible speech. So those distant surfaces that are coloured in the dark grey are absorptive on the ceiling and the walls, but directly above the speaker's head the surface is reflective. On the bottom right-hand side there is an example of another speech auditorium in which an architect provided a nice curved plywood ceiling. In this case, by putting in a concave-shaped ceiling, it was providing detrimental acoustic focusing of sound back towards the audience. It was therefore necessary to perforate the plywood panels and provide acoustically absorptive material behind these perforated panels to control reflections and reverberance within the space. Let's look at the case study of an office boardroom. Again, to provide clear, intelligible speech, the ceiling above the table should be sound reflective. This would provide a useful first order or first bounce reflection of direct sound off the ceiling to the other occupants within the boardroom. Around the room perimeter, and more distant surfaces where late reflections of sound could come back towards the listeners, these surfaces should be absorptive. The floor should be carpeted to control general reverberance in the space, and the wall areas at a seated head height should include a band of absorptive materials, for example fabric acoustic panels, to prevent late reflections of sound that would come back off the rear walls behind the listener, which would impair the speech intelligibility of the speech. Let's look at the case study of an assembly hall. And in this case, what I'm showing here is a 3D acoustic model of an assembly hall that has been converted from a basketball hall into a general assembly space. It had some interesting architectural features, including a skylight in the center of the space at ceiling level, a pitched roof, and also hard floors and hard walls. To be used successfully for speech, it was necessary to control reverberance within the space, general reverberance, but also to control discrete late reflections of sound off particular surfaces. In this case, the ceiling skylight needed to be treated with acoustic material to prevent a reflection of sound coming from the stage area, hitting the skylight and bouncing back towards the stage. So that skylight surface finish was treated with acoustic absorptive material. Ceiling treatment was also provided to control general reverberance, and also a band of absorption around the walls was used to control any loudspeaker sound that would project towards the audience, bouncing back towards the audience and the stage area. This graphic shows a reflection history of sound from one of the loudspeakers in that assembly hall to an audience member located at the centre of the auditorium. On the bottom right there, you can see loudspeaker A1 and receiver location 01. And in this case, it is showing a sound ray bouncing off the rear wall, bouncing off the floor, and being heard at the listener location. The diagram in the top left-hand side here shows the reflection history with time of sound coming out of that loudspeaker A1 to receiver location 01. At the 0 time frame, as shown here, we have the direct sound arriving at the listener at a level of about 66 dB or decibels. We can then see the successive reflections of sound off different surface finishes with time. We can see up to 50 milliseconds, we get some useful early reflections of sound showed by the blue lines here. Any sound arriving before 50 milliseconds combined with the direct sound would improve the speech intelligibility of that spoken word. Any sound reflections arriving after 50 milliseconds would be considered bad reflections, which would detrimentally affect the speech intelligibility in the space. As you can see here, reflection number 17, which corresponds to what is being shown in the bottom right here, results in a reflection arriving at the listener location of about 62 dB, about 70 milliseconds later than the direct sound. So this would impair the speech intelligibility of the spoken word. You can also see that there are further late reflections of sound arriving after 100 milliseconds, so about 120 milliseconds, and further to 200 milliseconds. We consider a bad reflection of sound is that it has the same level or within 10 dB of the direct sound being heard. Anything lower than 10 dB below the direct sound would not be perceived by the listener. So in this case, at 120 milliseconds, where we have a 50 dB reflection of sound, it possibly would not be considered annoying because it is over 10 dB below the direct sound at 66 decibels.